Welcome to Shooting Straight with A1F.com. I'm Frank Miniter, the editor-in-chief of the NRA's America's First Freedom. Today we have the great pleasure of speaking with Stephen Halbrook. Now, Stephen is an attorney, a constant contributor to America's First Freedom. He's a senior fellow with the Independent Institute and the author of 10 books, including The Right to Bear Arms, a Constitutional Right of the People, or A Privilege of the Ruling Class. Now, Steve just did a cover story for us. We headlined, "Here's an Uncomfortable Question for Gun Control Activists. What firearms have common use protections?" So, Steve, let's jump right in right there. What firearms that we own today, of course, have common use protections?
Well, so let's go to the origin of the common use doctrine. It really goes back maybe to the 19th century. I know it's been cited in cases like a case out of North Carolina in the 1920s. And basically that test says that if a type of weapon or arm or firearm is in common use by law-abiding people for lawful purposes, is protected by the Second Amendment or by state constitutional guarantees of the right to bear arms. In District of Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court articulated that test. And it's actually two tests, and they're really independent of each other. One is the common use test, and the other test is whether a type of firearm is typically used by law-abiding people for lawful purposes, because the court made separate statements really of both of those. And we start with the proposition, the assumption that the firearm is protected by the Second Amendment, and it's up to the state or the government to try to disprove that and to show that it's not commonly possessed or it's not typically possessed. And so you could have a type of arm that is commonly possessed, or maybe one that's not so commonly possessed. Maybe it's a new type of firearm, but is typically possessed for law-abiding purposes. We saw that in the Catano case. It wasn't a firearm; it was the electronic or electric type of stinger, so to speak. The device where you're just touching someone or you're shooting the prongs and you're disabling the person. It's a non-lethal type weapon. And I think the evidence in that case, maybe there were 200,000 people in the country that had them, something like that. And you could make a case that it's typically possessed. But with the AR-15, I got some data here. There's a recent study by William English, a Georgetown University professor, and he did the most extensive surveys, I think, that anyone's ever done. And he said in his findings there were just over 30% of gun owners had possessed or owned AR-15 type guns or similar guns, which equals just under 25 million people who have owned those types of rifles. So I would say that overwhelmingly passes the common use test. And furthermore, I've litigated some of the challenges to these bans as well as other people. And every one of these cases, just about, the courts of appeals freely admit that the AR-15 type rifle is commonly possessed by law-abiding people throughout the United States. And we did that. We started doing that just after Heller, when we challenged the District of Columbia law, a case called Heller 2. And we showed X million number of gun owners nationwide had AR-15 type rifles. And the Court of Appeals ruled against us, but it admitted that, yeah, they're in common use. But then they made up some other tests that the Supreme Court had not sanctioned to say that, well, we're going to uphold the ban anyway. And Judge Brett Kavanaugh was on that court at that time, and he wrote a nice dissenting opinion. Of course, he's on the Supreme Court now. So, but anyway, the test has really been around a long time, and I think it's a test that stems from pure reason. When the framers protected the right to keep and bear arms, what arms did they have and what kinds of arms were descendants of those arms? And so they had rifles and muskets and pistols and the blunderbuss and all of that. And we have the equivalents to those today.
As the market has introduced more, the common use, there's a lot of surveys and studies, and even the National Shooting Sports Foundation, just using guns made here and import imported into the United States. There's well over 20 million AR-15 type rifles. We're not going to use the more nebulous term assault weapon. I'm a New Yorker, and I mean that even according to the law here, the SAFE Act here includes shotguns with pistol grips. I don't know what number we'd get to if we tried to count according to their political means, but right, just the AR-15 alone has been counted well over 20 million, of course, in common use. But I'm curious about the other category you're talking about here. Is this gauging popularity and growth in a new product? Is that the difference in the two-pronged approach here?
The Supreme Court doesn't articulate an expanded reason for this distinction, but it in two different places it talks about the common use test and then the typical use test, and I think it's just like a general term that means, yeah, you could have a new product. It might not be that commonly possessed yet, but does it have typical lawful uses? There's a really good district court opinion out of the state of New York. New York had a ban, and I guess it still has it, on nunchucks, two sticks connected by a cord. What a horrible weapon that is, and it's mostly used by martial artists for exercise. Baseball bats are used in a lot more crimes than nunchucks, but they're mostly used for lawful purposes, and that's what you're looking at here. You look at the side of the people who are using it. Are they using it typically or commonly for lawful purposes? And anyway, there was a trial in that case, and the court held that, first of all, it was the state's burden to prove that the nunchuck was not typically possessed by law-abiding people for lawful purposes, or not commonly possessed in the same way. And of course, they couldn't do that. I mean, the evidence in the case was that people in the martial arts use them. I did research back in the 80s because it was a hot topic back then about banning them, and there was very, very few criminal cases that ever came up with nunchucks. So anyway, that's obviously not a firearm, but it is kind of a weapon. I mean,
I laughed out loud when you noted you were in a Senate hearing in the 80s, and I think it was Senator Kennedy who was pushing to ban them, and you took out a jump rope, which is two sticks combined by a cord, and started swinging it around, as you wrote for us. I mean, it's just absurd when you start to make it that literal.
Yeah, actually, they were defining nunchuck with that very definition, two sticks connected by cord, and so I had a jump rope. I stood up, and I swung it around in a figure eight. There had been a demonstration by a young martial artist, a female, earlier that morning. Very impressive, a great athlete. And so I just did the same thing. And so, yeah, Teddy didn't like it, and he turned beet red, but whatever. It was a mail order ban that was proposed. It was defeated. So.
Yeah, I was a kid during that period, and I remember making my own like every other 9-year-old did, and all I remember is hitting myself with those things. So a question then, these lower courts have ruled against common use protection. Some of them have the circuit level. What criteria? I mean, you're able to easily prove that these are commonly owned firearms. How were they able to argue this away?
Yeah, let me make 2 points on that. The first point is that every single AR-15 that's manufactured, when it is sold at retail, there's a NICS check, there's a background check, and the person has to pass the check. So don't tell me only criminals are buying these rifles. And we all know they're used disproportionately in very few crimes. So anyway, possessed by law-abiding people, the court in the Colby case out of the Fourth Circuit would not concede that, but it has to be the case that the first buyers are law-abiding people. They pass the background check. And the second point, that's the Colby case where they upheld the Maryland ban. That court wouldn't even admit that these rifles are commonly possessed. A lot more AR-15s are possessed than the most popular types of like trucks or other things in society that are so prevalent everywhere. They wouldn't admit that, and they made up this stupid doctrine. The Supreme Court in Heller said that, well, we're not going to say that the M16, the full auto military weapon, is protected. The M16 and like weapons And so the Fourth Circuit tried to say, oh, the AR-15 is a like weapon. Well, hello, the chief difference between machine guns and semi-autos is that you have to pull the trigger every single time to fire a shot with a semi-auto, and that's what makes it so radically unlike a full auto, where you just pull the trigger and it continues to fire until the cartridges are all gone. So it was a doctrine that only some judges who either they just wanted to rule against the people challenging the law just because they don't like them or it's their personal preference. They want to have gun bans. It's hard to think they're so ignorant about firearms that they would say a firearm that requires one trigger pull for every shot is like one that continues to fire with a single pull of the trigger. And if you look at the distinctions made in federal law since the NFA 1934 or in the laws of many states, that's such a fundamental difference. So yeah, you're right. There have been courts that deny that AR-15s are in common use, but it's just plain wrong.
So in essence, they're making a cosmetic argument. It's looks. It's they find these scary or look a certain way or something because the semi-automatic design it's by far the most popular. It's not just AR-15s. I've tried to measure it before. It's very difficult to do, but it hundreds of millions, I mean, potentially, counting pistols and shotguns and so on, semi-automatic firearms owned and totally in common use by the American public. It's the most common type of firearm, a semi-automatic firearm, which is what the AR-15 is.
That's why they never just passed a blanket ban on semi-autos. There were just too many owners. And so what they try to do is pick out rifles in particular that look different or that look too modern for them. And so that's how they latched on to, oh, it's got this conspicuously protruding pistol grip or other things like that allows you to hold it in a stable way so it's accurate. And if you contrast that with, let's say, the California compliant rifle, it it has a fin that makes you look like you're hitchhiking when you hold the grip. Your thumb is in the up position. You cannot wrap your thumb around the grip so you can access the safety selector. I mean, what kind of deal is that? It's like you're hitchhiking, and it's less stable to hold the rifle. So what's the point of that? Well, that's the kind of idiocy that you get into when you try to select these features that make a rifle more proficient and accurate, and you want to find which ones can we ban. That's why they never banned the Ruger Mini 14 unless it had a folding stock. Just too many people owned them. They knew they couldn't do it.
Well, semi-automatic rifles, it goes back to the very early 20th century. Very popular rifles made by Savage and Remington and so on. They marketed them with advertising, calling them, actually they called them often automatic rifles at the time. It was just a usage thing. But they were just commonly owned and commonly sold going forward. I mean, through the 20th century and the late 19th century, even is when we were developed, it's such a common old type of platform. So as you look at this, and we're awaiting this big Supreme Court decision in Bruin, it's a different case, but do you see any clarification coming into this issue from that case?
I certainly hope on the standard of review the Supreme Court will give more guidance, and I think it will because it's going to decide um, the Bruin case on the merits. Apparently, I mean, courts can surprise you and do different things. I think if you're betting on the case, I think there's going to be a victory for the challengers of the New York law. That's not a guarantee, obviously, but um, the court will explain itself in detail, and I think some of the justices have called out for that, for the court to go into more detail in how we evaluate Second Amendment cases. It really has to do that because these lower courts, starting with Heller too, made up the idea that you use intermediate scrutiny, and they don't even use correct intermediate scrutiny. They just say something like, well, okay, the government end to reduce crime is a good end. Well, yeah, everybody agrees with that. But the means to that end doesn't do anything to get you there. So the court's going to have to, what most people think is explain in more detail the approach it took in Heller and then in McDonald text, history, and tradition. What does the text say? The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, now that's a no-brainer. You're going to ban all these rifles, and you're saying it's not an infringement, or that arms aren't, you really don't have a right to have it. So we went on the text. And then history and tradition. At the founding, we never had anything like this. You know, we never had any kind of rifle ban until 1989. It started in California. And it was always, before then, rifles and shotguns good, long guns good, pistols bad, handguns bad. And the anti-gun movement, they got their nose bloodied in Massachusetts in a referendum, which they lost on a handgun ban. They only got handgun bans enacted in D.C. and in Chicagoland. And so all of a sudden they were able, Violence Policy Center made up this idea about confusing AR-15 semi-autos with M16s or machine guns, and the public you could pull the wool over the public's head and they wouldn't know what you were talking about. And so then it became possible through the use of this propaganda term, assault weapon, to ban these firearms. But remember, before that, it was always rifles good, handguns bad. And that's what changed the tune. They made it was a masterpiece of a propaganda effort to do that.
Mm-hmm. So since the McDonald decision v. Chicago in 2010, we've been waiting more than a decade for this decision. So hopefully we do get the clarification, as lower courts have really disagreed with each other, the kind of thing that the Supreme Court usually steps in to resolve, and now hopefully they will. So tell me, Steve, thanks for your perspective on this. It's always just incredible. Where can people find you, find your books?
Well, my latest book is The Right to Bear Arms, if I'm showing that correctly, A Constitutional Right of the People or a Privilege of the Ruling Class. The subtitle is a question, but you know what the answer is. You can, my website, stephenhalbrook.com. I've got my other books up, or you can just Google my name and find all kinds of books and articles and whatnot. So anyway, thank you for having me again, and I'm glad to see you.
Thank you, Steve.